I spent 30 years in the British Army fighting exactly the kind of terrorism and extremism that Israel faces today. I fought in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in the Balkans, and various other places in the Middle East. Therefore, the kind of challenges and threats that Israel faces are very, very familiar to me. The way that this conflict has been portrayed in many, many media outlets, by many reporters, by some politicians around the world, is the mirror opposite of reality. Israel has been demonized, Israel has been accused of committing war crimes. The real war crimes here have been committed by Hamas. Hamas initiated the conflict.
The bodies of 3 missing Israeli teens have been found. You may remember they disappeared June 12th near a settlement in the West Bank.
And now a senior Hamas leader living in exile in Turkey is claiming that Hamas was responsible for the deaths of those 3 Israeli teens.
Israelis running for shelter in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, seeking safety from Hamas rockets launched from Gaza, now a daily occurrence across Israel.
It's called Lower Gaza, the network of tunnels built by Hamas that snake their way from Gaza into Israel. This terrifying attack shows Hamas militants attacking Israeli soldiers after surfacing from a tunnel in Israel.
Israel had no choice but to respond. That Hamas wished to use their people as human sacrifices, as human shields. Numerous cases we've seen of UN schools being used to store weapons in, to attack IDF forces.
Hamas has not only been using mosques, but even a church compound to attack Israeli citizens.
Well, the United Nations says they did find some weapons, Hamas weapons, in a United Nations school. It's not the first time they say this has happened.
We're seeing Hamas setting up for a rocket launch just meters away from our hotel, and again, as I point out, bang in the middle of what is a residential area full of hotels.
The whole purpose of Hamas's human shield strategy is to have the death of their own people, which means that Israel is always the bad guy. No matter what it does, it is always the bad guy in the world.
This continued killing of women and children in a way that appears to be indiscriminate is asinine.
I listen to the policies of senior officers, of generals, of colonels in the IDF, and the policies that they pass down forbid their soldiers from carrying out attacks against a target when there are innocent civilians in the target zone. If there are civilians there, they will take action to remove the civilians, and they will do that by radio messages, by text messages, by dropping leaflets.
Leaflets were dropped by the Israeli Defense Forces over the course of the day, warning residents that they would target Hamas targets.
Israel has taken enormous steps to prevent the deaths of innocent civilians, far more than many other armies would take. What we've seen is a fixation with the Gaza conflict. Now, what's gone on there is extremely tragic, but at the same time, almost unnoticed, and certainly largely ignored by the media, has been the continued killing in Syria. We've had fighting in Yemen, in Nigeria, in many other East African countries, in Iraq. Many, many Christians have been butchered, and others have been attempts to force them to convert or drive them out of the country. We haven't seen any protests even remotely like the protests that we're seeing around the world against what's been happening in Gaza. The one conflict that the world seems more concerned about than any other is the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. And this is not a coincidence. It's not because there is particular concern among certain sections of society about Palestinian Arabs being killed. This is all about who is doing the fighting, and it's all about anti-Israel. Israel should not be lectured by any country in the world about its humanity. Israel is an extremely humane country. It's a Western liberal democracy, and it's as strong in its morality, it's strong in its ethos, as its human ethos, as any other country in the world. And although I'm not Israeli and I'm not Jewish, I find it personally insulting to hear Israel abused in this way. I believe that the evil of violent Islamic jihad is an evil that faces the entire Western world.
Hamas is ISIS, ISIS is Hamas. They're the enemies of peace. They're the enemies of Israel. They're the enemies of all civilized countries.
The destruction of the state of Israel is not Hamas' final destination. Hamas' final destination is building the Islamic Khilafah, which means an Islamic state on the rubble of every other civilization.
This is not just a fight that Israel's fighting, it's a fight that affects all of us. Israel's actually at the front line of the fight, and Israel deserves our support at the front line, because you can be certain that the terror that's being aimed at Israel will be aimed at our own countries next.